So welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. Today we take a fresh look at Korach's rebellion. Dathan and Abiram, Korach's sons, refer to Egypt as a land flowing with milk and honey, and defy Moses's, were he even to offer fields and vineyards in a land flowing with milk and honey, still we would not come. What does the biblical flowing with milk and honey mean? Join us for today's episode, Milk and Money. Well, welcome. Every week I try to figure what am I going to talk about that we didn't talk about last year. And last year we talked about, the Midrash that said that Korach and all of the 250 Levites showed up in a talit kulo techelet, in a garment that was all blue. And this year, I read the text afresh without any midrashim, and I discovered, as you could tell in the intro, that there was something I had never noticed before, and it was a reference to what everybody knows is a namesake of the land of Israel, a land of milk and honey. So we are in Numbers 16, and Korach obviously comes in front of Moses, and he starts a rebellion. And the punchline of his rebellion is, "You have gone too far, Rav Lachem." And he says, "When did you raise yourselves above God's congregation? Madua tinasu al kahal Adonai Hashem." And Moses fell on his face, and Moses made a test that everybody should gather the next day with pans of incense, and whoever's offering would be accepted, that would prove that God was on their side. And then we get to verse 12. And it says, Moses sent for Dathan and Abiram, sons of Eliab, but they said, "We will not come." So Moses asked for these guys to come, and they wouldn't come. And they said as follows, "Is it not enough that you brought us from a land flowing with milk and honey to have us die in the wilderness, that you would also lord it over us? Even if you had brought us to a land flowing with milk and honey, and even if you had given us possession of fields and vineyards, should you gouge out the eyes of those involved, we will not come." So, had you ever noticed this? I'm sure you had, but what do you make of the textual argument? Number one, I had never realized that the land of Egypt, who, we always refer to as the flesh pots of Egypt, where you could have watermelon and all of this stuff, that it was referred to as a land flowing with milk and honey. And I never heard this argument where, it almost sounds like the lady does protest too much when somebody says, "Even if you offer me this, I won't come." You kind of get a sense of what bothers them. And they said, even if you were to give us fields and vineyards and gouge out our eyes, we wouldn't come. What do you make of all this?
Yeah, so that's kind of funny. When you rebel against somebody, sometimes the arguments aren't logical. It's interesting that you mentioned last year how, the rabbis try to make Korach's argument very logical. He says, does a garment that's all blue need tzitzis that are blue? Does a house that's filled with Jewish books need a mezuzah? That's very logical. But actually, if you look at the text is the opposite. The argument that they make is not really very logical, because the argument that they make is really that, even if you would have given us good things, we still wouldn't have come. And you know what? That's a lie. That's just a lie. It's not true. They want good things. What they don't want is they don't want Moses telling them what to do. So I think it's interesting just to play the text against the rabbinic interpretation.
So I totally agree with you, but I literally am stepping back and I am just listening to what they say. And, I kind of joked and said maybe the lady protests too much, methinks, from Shakespeare. But if you remember back when Abraham wanted to buy a burial place for his wife Sarah, and he's talking to a Hittite prince called Ephron. And Ephron says, take it for free. We want to give it to you. And Abraham constantly says, no, I want to buy it. I want to buy it. So Ephron finally says, my lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver. What's that between me and you? And of course, that was a hefty sum, not a bargain. And Abraham settled for that amount. And I really think that the text in a literary fashion and historic fashion is doing the same thing with Dathan and Abiram. And when they say, let's forget about the reference to milk and honey, but when they say, even if you had given us possessions of fields and vineyards, we would not come. I learned from that that's what's bothering them. And of course, we've touched upon this many times on the podcast, that what makes the tribe of Levi and the Kohanim subset unique is that they did not have fields and vineyards. Their portion was God's. And I think that once you look at the argument from that perspective, and then you go back and even read Rav Lachem, maybe that's their argument. They are protesting that Moses and Aaron made this ridiculous decision in their mind to forego the possession of fields and vineyards, and they've taken on too much, and they're holier than thou, and these guys want to have fields like everybody else. I've not seen anybody give this explanation, but what do you think of it, Rabbi?
I like that explanation. Let's go one step at a time. Who are they rebelling against? Are they rebelling against Moses, or rebelling against Aaron, or rebelling against the whole system? I think there are three options.
Well, I mean, I think even if you say they're rebelling against the whole system, since Aaron and Moses and God are part of the system, they're rebelling against the whole shebang. And
right. That's
the question is.
I'm in agreement with you.
And
I think they're rebelling against the whole shebang.
And I think for us moderns, and even not so moderns, even those under the influence of Greek democracy, it's very easy to say, Rav Lachem, you've taken too much, which is you have special rights and privileges, and we should have that too. And of course, for a Levi to make that argument, it's not as strong as an argument as with a Yisrael making it. For a Levi saying to a Cohen, you're taking too much, correct me if I'm wrong, but yes, the Cohen has certain obligations and also privileges that outrank a Levi. So even if a Levi is eating food that is holy and sacrificed to him, he might take off truma, a tenth, and give it to the Kohen. But ultimately, he's part of the same system, so it's kind of tenuous for a Levi to argue to a Cohen, why are you so exclusive? I want to have all the privileges you have, but God forbid I will be a Pashut Yisrael, a simple Israelite.
Well, that's what's interesting. They really want Aaron's position, or Korach wants Aaron's position. He wants to, it's almost as if he says, Moshe, it's okay, Moshe got what Moshe got. But, why did they get two in the family? That's not fair. See, what I'm really arguing is the nepotism comes in Aaron, not in Moshe. That's my argument. Moshe is chosen by God. That goes back to the burning bush. Aaron sounds like maybe he's chosen by Moses. And that's not fair because Aaron's his brother. I'm just raising that as an option.
Okay, so now I continue reading the Parsha, and for the rest of chapter 16 that we started with, and for the whole of chapter 17, it goes into what happens. So just to review quickly, the earth opens up, and the earth swallows Korach and his 250 co-rebels. And then God is still angry and says, enough already with these people, and a plague begins. And now we're getting hundreds and thousands of other Israelites who are, I guess, into that plague. And then we get, and this blew me away, to Numbers 18. And starting with Numbers 18:8, it says, God spoke further to Aaron, and he starts delineating exactly what privileges the tribe of Aaron gets. In verse 9, he says, this shall be yours from the most holy sacrifices, the offerings by fire, every such offering that they render to me as most holy sacrifices, namely every meal offering, sin offering, guilt offering of theirs shall belong. He says, Zeh yeh lecha mikdash hakadashim. Basically, he's saying, all of those things that I promised you, you still get. And then he goes on in 11, and he goes, this too shall be yours, the gift offerings, the elevation offerings. I gave to you and your wives, to your sons, and to the daughters that are with you, as a due for all time, every one of your household. And then he continues in verse 13, the first fruits, the bikurim of everything in their land that they bring to God shall be yours. Every one of your household who is pure may eat. And he goes on and he says, their meat shall be yours, it shall be yours like the breast of elevation, so forth and so on. And it shall be an everlasting covenant of salt before God for you and for your offspring. And then he goes on to say in verse 20, and God said to Aaron, you shall, however, have no territorial share among them or own any portion in their midst. I am your portion and your share among the Israelites. And to the Levites, I hereby give all the tithes in Israel as their share in return for the services they perform, the services of the tent of meeting. And finally, in verse 23, he says, but they shall have no territorial share among the Israelites. Lo yinachalu nachala. So I'm reading this from the context of this throwaway comment that Dathan and Abiram said, where even if you were to give us land, even if you were to give us vineyards, we wouldn't come. And I interpret that to be the crux of their complaint. And here at the end, the Parsha ends with a formal delineation, not only of what they have, but that they have no territory. To me, it's a complete literary whole, and it absolutely bakes the whole argument from beginning to end.
Yeah, that's interesting. So what do you make of it? I like that. What do you make of that? So what is that? What happens to the argument?
So it seems to me that the argument is basically one of crass materialism, that the Levites and Korach are saying, you gave away too much, you were too holy. We also want territory, we also want vineyards. What have you done to us? And God, Moses, Levi, Aaron reject their claim. And we learn about the whole thing, as we will find out later on. There is a tradition that Dathan and Abiram survived. We'll get to that later.
That's interesting also.
We get to that later. But for now, after all of that is done, this is the formal legislation about this amazing concept that we talked about for many times, where in Egypt, the priests were the gods. The priests were the ultimate power. They had material power. They were the ones that Joseph didn't take taxes from. They had the honey. They had the milk. And they own the afterlife, which is ultimately the final arbiter of power, especially if you look at the Catholic Church, where it's all about getting into the pearly gates. And here, the revolution of our people in the desert at Sinai was it took them from them. Moses and Aaron gave it freely, and Korach is giving one final rebellion against that, and here we have it resolved. So, what do you take of my argument, Rabbi?
I think your argument is interesting. First of all, the rebellion. Let's kind of take a step back. I like your argument a lot. The rebellion. So I raised the question whether the rebellion was against Moshe or the rebellion's against Aaron. My next question is, rebellions always reflect a weakness in the leadership. You only have a rebellion when the leader is weak. What is your argument about, how does your argument relate to that? Are Moses and Aaron weak? And is that what Korach and Dathan and Abiram are pushing? Do they see a weakness? Do they see a problem? What do you think?
Look, I'm going to cut it short because I want to hear from Nachum. But I think whenever you have a revolutionary movement, ultimately you get to a point where there's a falling out. And the inner group breaks apart, whether it's a Trotsky and a Lenin. And I think this is a revolutionary idea. That's what I take away. I think the weakness of the idea is how radical it is. And I think that Korach is showing us, that's the importance of Korach. He is the straw dummy who shows us just how radical a move it was by God, by the Torah, by Moses and Aaron. Nachum, welcome to the Bima.
So I was saying I don't totally agree with your interpretation, Geoffrey. I feel that Korach was trying to usurp first the power of Moshe, and that he had the right as, if you will, interpreter of Chumash, its legacy, and Jewish decisor. And therefore, the reason I raised the question of two miracles is the second rebellion was really against the priesthood, and that was relegated, to Aaron in the level of that he convened, which was spirituality. Hence, the first miracle is what happened. The earth swallows up a bunch of people. Many were spared because Moshe intervened. The second miracle, which you didn't relate to when you're going through your verses, comes afterwards. It's when God commands that they set up their staffs and see what happens. And the only staff that blossoms is Aaron. That's a symbol that his staff blossomed, convincing people that the rebellion against him was one of spirituality. In fact, Rav Aaron Soloveitchik interpreted that the reason that his staff was made of shaked, I'm not sure what shaked is.
Not an almond? Is it an almond?
It's an almond, but right. But etymologically, supposedly, at least according to Rav Aaron Soloveitchik, an almond, any place it's planted, it can be blossomed. So in any event, there are two miracles. There are two rebellions. One, not that they weren't against both of them, but one against Moshe because of his interpretation of Torah. It was a threat to his leadership. And the second one against the spiritual leadership of Aaron, hence his staff blossomed, and maybe, indicating spirituality can grow in any place.
I think your focus is on the miracles and the punishment and the symbolism.
It's on the rebellions and the response to the rebellions through those miracles.
Got it.
Okay.
So, I think that's valid.
So let's go back, Geoffrey, to your interpretation.
So at the crux of my interpretation, and I said this, it's all about the money. I went into the rabbinic texts, and we don't know a lot about Korach. One of the rabbinic texts in the Talmud Pesachim 119a says that he was one of the richest men of all times. So the rabbis took it upon themselves to say, he actually worked for Joseph and he found out where the riches, it kind of reads like the lost ark, that there were these riches that were brought down from Canaan into Egypt, and they came back to Israel. In Solomon's time, we know from our talk with the Reverend how they went to Cush and then they went to... So Korach is targeted as a very rich person. And, the other rich person that disappears by the rabbinic tradition at this time is our old friend Nachshon, who, the legend has it, also was the only one
And he disappears. He should have been part of the spies last week, and he wasn't.
Correct. And the rabbis, they only have good things to say about him, but one thing that they say that's not so good is that when Nachshon brought his offering, it says he brought his offering on the first day. And the rabbis interpret this to mean that whereas the other Nasiim, the prince, got the offering from their tribe, Nachshon was rich. And he had his own money. So I think one of the takeaways, even that made it to the rabbinic tradition, is that, again, feeding into what I was saying, that Korach was actually interested in having, he didn't want the whole Cohen thing, he didn't want the whole Levi thing. He wanted a possession, he wanted a nachla in the land, and it's all about crass capitalism. And I just wonder, do you feel that there was a thread in rabbinic tradition that had an issue with wealth? I mean, we certainly see plenty of instances where there were certain great scholars who were very wealthy and all that. But why?
In the Torah, it's very important. Nobody is wealthy in the Torah. Abraham has a lot of flocks, and actually it gets him in trouble because with Lot he has a problem because they're both wealthy and they fight with one another. Wealth is not a value in the Torah.
So certainly, in the beginning, I stayed away from the rabbinic interpretations, and I said, let's just read the text. And I gave an interpretation, and now looking at the rabbinic, there is a little bit of a reference to that he was a wealthy man looking out for his vested interests. So I think that's one thing. And I think, in a sense, his interpretation of a land flowing with milk and honey, he compared the land of Egypt and the land of Israel. He, talking about what you were saying, Nachum, about the spiritual aspect, he didn't see the spiritual aspect. He saw Egypt as a rich country, as crass as it was, how it had slaves and how it took advantage of people. No, he looked back with great nostalgia. And when he said, if you promise me the land of Canaan is a land flowing with milk and honey, he saw it as a parallel, and he wanted a piece of it. So that's how I see it, and that's, I think, the first interpretation that we get of a land flowing with milk and honey. And for the remaining time that Len stands with us, I thought we would talk about what actually a land flowing with milk and honey has been taken to mean. And I think, the most obvious is it's a sign of fertility. If you look at Exodus 3:8, where God says, I have come down to rescue them from the Egyptians, to bring them out of that land to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the region of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. This concept of fertility this concept of flowing, which almost has a sensual aspect to it. I mean, if you think of the word zav, normally when we come across the word zav, it has to do with almost with issues and bodily functions and sensuality and sex. So I think that the way that we take it is one that's very sensual. If you look at the Song of Songs 4:11, it says, "Sweetness drops from your lips, O bride. Honey and milk are under your tongue, and the scent of your robes is like the scent of Lebanon." So I think that in our tradition, not in Korach's tradition, we saw a land oozing, flowing with milk and honey as something that was set aside and was a differentiator from a land of Egypt. And I think that's the most basic interpretation. What does land flowing with milk and honey mean to you?
So it's different than Egypt, even though Egypt was clearly a very prosperous land. Milk and honey, Egypt is never described as milk and honey, but Egypt actually, the Nile River is what makes Egypt successful. Isn't that right? Everything's around the Nile. Pharaoh is around the Nile. He's always at the Nile. It's not milk and honey, it's water, it's river, it's something like that. But milk and honey represents a flowing. It's something that, let me just take it back a second. You say flowing like Zav is sensual or sexual. I think flowing is continuous.
And what I should have emphasized when I said sexual, I was getting back to fertility. It's very fertile.
Okay, I think that's right. I mean, I think that's part of it. When you flow, it continues to go. When the river flows, it continues to go.
And the flip side of fertility is infertility. So whereas the Nile was dependable and didn't give rise to a nation that prayed for rain and was dependent on the heavens and the spiritual, I think that again is part of what makes milk and honey so important, and the flow. If you take milk to mean cow's milk or goat's milk, and if you take honey, and we're going to get into whether it's bees' honey or honey from dates, fruit juice, you could also maybe say that it's a land that combines agriculture with herding, which is something that we have.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't think of that. You could explain it that way, that it covers both.
So let's talk a little bit about honey. Davash, which I think most people on the street, if you would ask them, they would say, oh, it's bees honey.
Right.
So as fascinating as it may seem, we need to go to the Talmud to confirm that bees honey is kosher. Because there is a principle that what emerges from a non-kosher animal is non-kosher.
Right.
And that is in Bikorot 5b. And the Gemara in 7b raises the question, and it says, what do the sages say about honey of bees? Or is it permitted? And they give two reasons that it's permitted. One is because they bring the nectar from the flowers into their body, but they do not excrete it from their body. So the first is that all the work of the bees are worker bees. So they process the nectar, and so it actually isn't, you're not eating something that comes from a bee. And then Rav Sheshet said, in accordance with Rabbi Yaakov, who said that actually we have a special verse. The verse says in Leviticus, yes, these may you eat of all winged creatures. Why does it say this? And the rabbis say you may not eat a non-kosher winged creature, but you may eat that which is non-kosher winged creature discharges. And what is that? That is the honey of bees. So it's fascinating if you think about it, especially if you think of Rosh Hashanah, or you think of when a child starts to study Torah, that they lick, though each word is covered with honey, that bee honey is kosher by way of either some biological knowledge on the part of the rabbis, or by a special verse that permits us to eat us. And I think that is kind of fascinating.
That is absolutely fascinating. That's so interesting. Well, first of all, it's interesting just the discussion about bee honey and the fact that something that comes from a non-kosher animal is not kosher, why bee honey is an exception. That in itself is fascinating, right? Just the Talmudic discussion is fascinating.
And I think it's not the subject matter of today's talk.
Right.
But if you want to talk about a woman's right to her body, what most of Talmudic law states is what is in the womb of a female animal or person is part and parcel of that female mother. And if she's tameh, it's tameh. If a cow is shechted, slaughtered with an embryo inside, the embryo doesn't need to be slaughtered. We have a very strong tradition of identifying what's inside of a mother with the mother. Just an aside. But in any case, that's honey. I think that it's fascinating to think that something as we associate so strongly with our religion is nonetheless something that needs to be debated. And it's true, if you do a Google search about vegans debate whether they can eat honey.
That's correct.
So
there are some vegans who don't eat honey and some vegans who do eat honey, and that's basically the two opinions in the Gemara.
So the other opinion is that Davash is from a date. Right. And in Deuteronomy, for instance, when it lists the famous Sheva Minim, the 7 species, the last one is and honey. And it certainly doesn't mean bees honey.
Correct. That's definitely date honey.
So if that's the case, then certainly we have something about agriculture and the milk that I think is very nice.
And I think we can finish off with Nachum's point. The fact that the staff blossom also has to do with agriculture.
Absolutely.
Right? I think your point is right, and the fact that the symbol, that Moses and Aaron were right, was the fact that the staff blossom. That's part of this whole thing.
So the way that I want to finish, and I told you in the pre-story I was going to mention this, is there is a tradition that the 2 sons of Korach actually survived. And there's also a tradition that there's a special psalm that we say every day. And on the Psalm of Monday, which in the creation narrative, God does not say it is good. We all know on Tuesday he says Pamayim Kitov. On Monday he doesn't say Kitov once, because that's when God made a division. And he made a division between heaven and earth. And Korach is associated with trying to make a division. And on Monday we say Psalm 48, which is one of 8, I believe, psalms that are in the name of Livnei Korach, the children of Korach, who the tradition feels somehow are uniquely in a unique position from down in that pit that was swallowed by the earth to sing the praise of God and try to bring the parts back together. And I think the takeaway from that and the fact that we have honey from a bee who might not be altogether kosher is that, as Shlomo Korach said, you never know. You never know where purity can come from. And that, at the end of the day, is the sweetness that comes out of a very bitter story of Korach.
Fantastic. I love the end. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Next week, I'll be coming to you from Jerusalem. We're going to do it at 4 p.m. New York time, 11 p.m. Israel time. Can't wait to speak to you from Jerusalem. Shabbat Shalom. Enjoy the parasha. Be well.
Shabbat Shalom to everybody. Have a great one.